Greetings, Guardians, my name is Bife here. So, really quickly, again, I am not on my normal microphone. This is a temporary setup while my PC gets repaired. Apologies again for the lackluster audio quality in comparison to what you guys are usually used to. We will get this fixed as soon as possible, but for the next couple, maybe 3-4 videos, this is probably going to be what you're going to hear from me. Apologies about that, we'll get that fixed as soon as we can. So, this is not so much a lore video, as it's a bit of commentary on the trajectory of Destiny as a franchise, and what we can expect from the story in the future. As many of you know, I've been covering the game since its first alpha, which means that I've been watching the story pan out over the whole projected 10-year plan that was talked about at the very start of it all. In that time, I've seen Destiny evolve, from a game that had only 20 vault slots to a game that now lasts longer than some of the platforms that it could be played on. Rest in peace, Stadia. Across the decade of experience of coverage, I think it'd be fair to say that the narrative has also changed beyond comparison, and I don't just mean that because now there is one. Yeah, the D1 vanilla days were pretty rough. At various moments in Destiny's history, across the last decade, there have been massive inflection points that have changed the nature of the narrative that we've been presented with, and at this moment in time, I think we're about to start another one. Some of you might even argue, and I'd say that it's a reasonably fair argument, that we've already seen the latest great inflection point. So, where do we start looking at all of this to understand it, and why is it important? Well, we'd have to go back to the beginning, but we have to understand why it's important, and at that note, I want to actually compare what someone else has said about a different part of the game. Take a look at the latest slew of news and updates about system changes in Destiny, and take a look at all the buzz around on Twitter and YouTube, and you'll find some commentary from other creators. In particular, I want to highlight this tweet from the well-respected Astacross, who simply stated, "This is a Destiny 3 change." Narratively speaking, the series has had different jumps and breakpoints, and much like Lightfall seems to be doing for gameplay, I believe that we're about to approach such a jump point for the story. I believe that as well as the gameplay getting a quote Destiny 3 type change, I think we're also about to see the narrative go through this as well. So to understand this, let's go back into the past and let's talk in broad brushstrokes about Destiny's big narrative arcs. It's been stated a few times by Bungie that structurally, there are sort of 3 arcs to Destiny's narrative progression. To paraphrase and simplify, you can break these 3 arcs down into the Age of Light, the Age of Shadow, and the Age of Darkness. These different ages or arcs were supposed to represent the nature of the storytelling that the narrative would pass through, and for the most part, they have. It's also fair to say that each of these different ages aligns with the kind of narrative forces that are present in that story moment. We saw the Age of Light in the first 3 years, we saw the Age of Shadow in the next 3, and in the latest iterations of Destiny 2, we have seen what would be called the Age of Darkness, starting kind of with Witch Queen, which prospectively would have been a Destiny 3 if the game had continued on 3-year cycles. It did not, of course, do this though. The Age of Light was narratively simple, and honestly, it's not hard to see that. The whole of Destiny as a universe and a tale is centered around a nebulous conflict at this point, which is really still struggling to define its bounds. This conflict of light versus dark is so vague that it's really hard to attach any significant ideas to it, and it's really hard to divine its identity beyond a very simple premise, which is simply this: the light is good and the darkness is bad. We had assumed that various enemy factions could be all attributed to the minions of the darkness, and therefore they were fresh cannon fodder that could easily be killed. This meant there was very little moral depth and complexity, and that shows a lot narratively speaking. Story beats in the first few years, such as the Dark Below and the Taken King, had massive villains that allowed the player to definitely focus on the idea that they were the good guys. There was very little moral ambiguity about Oryx or Crota, and in this case it was kind of a reason why the Hive was such a common opponent back then. The Hive are not a very morally ambiguous enemy at this point. This is the moment at which it's very easy for you to call the enemies in Destiny evil. There is nothing complicated about that at all. The light was not only morally correct, but also it was morally simple. If I told you back in the day that someone could be blessed by the light of the Traveler and not be a Guardian, it would be, known, but it would be a little bit weird to have to point it out, because the two are so commonly interchanged and seen as one and the same. There is no distinction between Lightbearer and Guardian, just in the same way there is no distinction between the forces of the city, the Guardians, the will of the Traveler, or anything along those lines. It is a single front, not made up of multiple individuals. All of them seem to serve the same purpose. And in the instances where that rule was broken, where you had characters in the backstory and lore such as Dredge and Yor, they were really the exceptions that proved the rule. The most important thing about these stories, from a broad narrative standpoint, was that they were telling us about who we were as Guardians, and ultimately it was telling us not only that we were good, but that the light was good. But ultimately it was about us and defining who we were in the world of Destiny that was evolving around us. In Destiny 1, and the Age of Light more generally across the first 3 years of the game, we faced off against the Heart of the Black Garden, Crota, the son of Oryx, Skolas, the mad Kell of Kells, and Oryx, the Taken King. All of these villains presented a fairly simple notion that they were evil and the light was good, and again, that simplicity ruled. It gave us purpose and place in the universe. That was kind of important, but also there was no further thought required. Even in the final expansion of Destiny 1, where we would see the more complicated threat of Siva rising only to be crushed by the returning Iron Lords, you would see that the light, even with these ancient pre-Guardian forces, was seen as a protective and good force within the universe. The narratives are all in this instance very simple, and if I'm going to sum it up, you can present them best as black and white in terms of their morality. There is no moral depth or complexity that is presented by the main story. The lore would obviously present hints, however, that there was something greater going on. Even going into the first year of Destiny 2, which I would count as part of the Age of Light personally, when Ghaul stole the light of the Traveler, it was acknowledged that he was evil by the end of the story, because by the time he embraced the light and became one with it, he was rejected by the Traveler as it awoke, and his avarice and unworthiness to wield the light was firmly displayed. This was again a pretty simple cookie-cutter black and white morality story. There was nothing complicated about the death of Ghaul, at least in the sense that it wasn't hard to tell who was good and who was bad. This, however, would begin to represent the end of the era of simplicity, and not just in the sake of the narrative. A few months after the release of Destiny 2, it was clear that the game had been simplified to have a broader appeal, from weapons that we used to the speed of our Guardians to the nature of the story. Destiny had fallen into a place where it was clear that the darkness was still kind of our enemy, but the enemy was not being placed front and center. This is remembered as one of the worst times to play Destiny in the game's history as far as the core community is concerned. It was truly a year of discontent unlike anything that the core community has seen since. And for what it's worth, Bungie agreed. After the massive player summit that took place around about the time just before the release of the Warmind expansion, many content creators who attended brought back stories, and one of the biggest takeaways I remember hearing from it was the way that they discussed how Bungie devs were feeling. Bungie devs felt that the magic and love for the game that a lot of them had previously was gone. I remember reading that at the time, and I remember reading it and feeling hope because, well, Bungie was in our corner. But this was a moment at which simplicity wasn't what the game needed. It needed to evolve. And this, I think, was what really led us to the first inflection point. This was honestly quite lucky for us, because due to this first inflection point, change was around the corner. It's sometimes possible to narrow down an inflection point to a single moment when things change. Sometimes it's even possible to narrow it down to a single day. Sometimes it's a string of circumstances, and sometimes it's something that happens as a general movement across a season or a year. However, I think the first big inflection point in Destiny can be measured in two events: a calm that preceded a storm. The calm was seen on July 17th, 2018, with an innocuous update during the Warmind DLC. Players travelled to Io and discovered, upon the completion of the Taken Blight public event at the Lost Oasis, additional Taken bosses were spawning nearby. They were guarding a portal that led players into a nearby Lost sector. Thus began unfolding the mystery that led to what was at the bottom of the Lost Oasis, beneath the ruins of the Vex Strata, unfolding in dark corridors and caverns that led us to the festering remnants of a worm god known as Xol that we had already killed. By destroying the Taken within, we would finally unravel the mystery of the Whisper of the Worm, and we would claim the exotic for ourselves, and thus begin something new. To give a little context to why this is a big inflection point moment, and why it is the calm before the storm that was Forsaken, Destiny's greatest villain in Destiny 1 was Oryx, and at the apex of his story, he was turned into a weapon: the Touch of Malice. The Whisper of the Worm, the new exotic that players had just earned, followed suit seemingly, by placing a worm god within a weapon that we would now wield to take down the next great adversaries of Destiny. This was an inflection point, particularly because it not only signalled to the player base that we were about to go back to greater narrative stories, such as the Taken King, but it also told us about the future that we were about to experience in a much more literal way. This weapon, in gameplay terms, was powerful, and Guardians in Destiny 2's first year were not. It suddenly opened up whole new worlds of DPS for Guardians, and it signalled what was going to happen in the changes to the weapon system that were being implemented later down the line. This was a moment at which we could competently look at Destiny and say, this game is about to return to what it should have always been. But narratively speaking, it was also a change. This weapon was a hint at an age where a narrative and moral simplicity was being brought to an end. It brought us back to the place where Destiny the Taken King had almost touched something different. The moment at which we had started to discard moral simplicity. This was a weapon that, unlike any before it, obviously was filled with darkness. It was truly Taken, and whilst we had wielded weapons before, such as Thorn, Necrochasm, and the Touch of Malice, this was quite unlike all of those, just based purely on its appearance and on how directly this darkness had sought us out. It was bowing to our own majesty and triumph, and in a strange way, it represented a death knell to the black and white morality of the Age of Light. We were fast approaching an age of shadow, and it would start with a clear signal as to what would be the arrival of the storm after the calm and the true entrance of the inflection point in Destiny's history, and that was Forsaken. Not only was Forsaken the expansion that is commonly remembered as one of the greatest Destiny expansions in history, but it's also remembered as a moment when the game changed its tone forever. Our Guardians in the narrative of the main campaign disobeyed the orders of the Tower and the Vanguard. We went after Uldren Sov to make him pay for the death of our dear friend, Cayde 6. Many of us felt justified in doing so at the time, even as our ghost pointed out to us that this might be more vengeance than it was justice. And whether you think that you killed him, or simply stood by as Petra killed him in the final cutscene of the Forsaken campaign, we were a part of his murder. And really, that's the point. The world of Destiny was telling us something here. In a larger, grander sense, it was saying that Destiny was no longer a place of black and white morality alone. We, as an audience, were presented with the larger narrative context of Uldren Sov's actions, and we could see that he was being deceived, misled, and controlled, effectively, by Riven of 1,000 Voices. Dramatic irony means that we understand that Uldren isn't the true evil here. he was being manipulated into committing all of his crimes. But as a resounding point throughout most of the community, I think it's fair to say that with a small exception, most of us didn't care. Most of us sought out revenge not just because it was the path that the campaign sent us on, but also because we felt compelled to, we wanted to. Destiny had never really displayed cruelty like it had with Uldren Sov's murder of Cayde, and it was a change in the tone of everything. Returning to the tower afterwards felt like a wake, but seeing our character stride off with the determination to kill Uldren made us feel like we had a purpose. That purpose was to show very clearly that this was no longer an age of black and white morality, that now we were not the ultimate moral arbiters of the world of Destiny. We were just actors within it. Good and bad were no longer easy to determine, and even after we found Riven, the ultimate perpetrator of the crimes against both Cayde and the Awoken people, defeating her would make us pause and wonder if we made the right choice too, as by killing Riven, we created the curse cycle that now consumes the Dreaming City and the Awoken people at large. Our place as the arbiters of Destiny's universe and its morality has been challenged, and in many ways by this point already it's been thrown on its head. And it would continue to occur as time went on, forcing us into this place where we realized that Guardians really were not necessarily moral beings. Certainly we were not always good. In the Season of the Forge, Ada 1 would go on to remind us that the warlords back in the old days of the Dark Age, just after the collapse, were also light-bearers, and that they had conducted many terrible evils against her and many others. In the following season, the Season of the Drifter, our new companion made through Gambit would force us to choose between our loyalties to him and the Vanguard, and would dub us to be either a Dredgen or a Snitch, all whilst reminding us in Gambit to embrace the dark as we turned on our fellow Guardians. In the Season of Opulence, we would become more well acquainted with Calus and continue to work with an agent that the Tower had not deemed an ally, all for our own personal gain and enrichment. During this time, we even saw the evolving story of the Last Word, Thorn, and Lumina, a moment which showed us that not only was the darkness that we had so believed to be obvious in Dredge and Yor not necessarily so simple, but also it could still be turned back into light. It was still something that could be redeemed, meaning that the lines between good and evil were blurred even more. There was no clear good anymore, especially when you looked at the other side of the Last Word and Thorn story with Shin Malphur, who, as it turned out, was one of the shadows of Yor, who had started the entire group of infamous Guardians that now also wielded Thorn. In Shadowkeep, we saw the first notes of a stronger dark power that was reaching out to us and making it clear that it was watching us, doting on us even. The first notes came in the lore that indicated that the choice of darkness would be much more possible for us to embrace than we first imagined. And as we prepared for this rising threat, in the end we would begin to reach out to the darkness and contact it during the Season of Arrivals. And all the while, Savathun would attempt to interfere, showing us that there was even a rift on the side of our so-called enemies, a rift between her and her ultimate master, the thing that controlled the Pyramid Fleet. Somehow Savathun was in opposition to it, which made no sense, especially when you compared her to her brother, the other ultimate evil of the Hive that we had thus far confronted. As we entered the era of Beyond Light, all pretenses that we should refrain from using darkness were dropped, and as the Exo-Stranger returned, it was revealed that not only would we be able to use the darkness, but that we could in fact do so and still be morally just. The line between light and dark is so very thin, says Elsie Bray, before encouraging us to cross it, leaving behind all pretense that light and dark can easily be tied to moral and immoral. The season of the Chosen and the season of the Splicer and even the season of the Lost then began to blur the moral lines even further and showed us the true depth and complexity of the different factions within this universe. No longer was it a simple case of black and white morality for even our enemies. Now the Cabal and Fallen had factions that allied closely with us in the end, whilst others were still at war with us. We didn't simply hate our enemies and fight them anymore because they weren't us. We hated and fought them because of what they stood for and who they supported. We had reasons to fight and hate them. We had reasons to forgive them. And perhaps more importantly, in the season of the Splicer, we saw the mirror lifted up to us, and we saw that we too could be monsters. Mithrax and Saint 14, in this respect, are two of the most important characters of this entire age, and since the days of D2 Vanilla he was hinted at, but the ultimate evolution of his story into the realization that sometimes we have been the butchers was the most important step in this moral arc. All the while, next to us we had Uldren. Uldren, who had been chosen as a guardian and had now been resurrected into Crow. This was the same person, but it really wasn't, and it showed us again that where evil previously existed, it was possible for there to be good. Even as we approached the end of the year, the season of the Lost technically saw us side momentarily with Savathûn, and showed us that the conflict in our system wasn't even as simple as light versus dark. There were multiple factions, there were wildcards, there were dark entities that were fleeing from the ultimate controller of the darkness. And soon, that would bode ill for us too. Even as we approached the end of the year, we were starting to see that there was an idea that there were no clear good guys and bad guys anymore. That idea has been thrown out the window, and the very concept of what is and isn't moral has become blurred. It has become distinguishable, but not in the same way it was in Destiny 1, where the light was unquestionably good and the darkness was unquestionably evil. And that point, I believe, was driven home finally in the Witch Queen. The light was no longer something that could be seen as good, and neither were Guardians in their completeness either. With Witch Queen, we saw the rise of the Hive Guardians, and it's at this point that I believe the argument of the Age of Shadow, that the lines between good and evil are not so well understood, and that morality in Destiny is truly made up of shades of grey, starts to form into completeness. Now, it's here at the dawn of Witch Queen that you can argue that the next inflection point has really begun, particularly due to the arrival of the Vow of the Disciple raid with Rhulk, particularly because this next age is kind of meant to be an age of darkness, and it would really start to be the case that we would face up against the Witness itself. At this point, the Witness had been named. We knew who our true and final enemy was. But ultimately, I feel as though that isn't the most important shift that happened in Witch Queen. I think that shift and the importance of it lay truly with the Hive Guardians and Savathûn's brood. This was the moment at which we would all sit there and have to say that no, Guardians, if you're to extend the full phrase, are not all truly good. And by that same token, the light can't be either. And maybe not even the Traveller, considering that it chose the Hive Guardians by proxy of its ghosts. No one could truly be said to be good or evil anymore just based on who they were. You had to look at someone's actions to determine what they were in the universe of Destiny, and this again leads into that moment where we have this evolving note about the shades of moral greyness. It's not just about understanding who we are anymore, it's also about understanding who our true enemies are based on what they've done. It's not hard to see how this radical change for some could be seen as the inflection point for Bungie, and I think it's clear that they saw Witch Queen and even Beyond Light as the true beginning of their Age of Darkness. But narratively speaking, I think that the inflection point is really happening now, as we approach Lightfall, I think that in this moment we're truly entering the third era of Destiny's narrative. And what is that era supposed to be? Well, just as Aztecross stated that this is a Destiny 3 change when he spoke about the new gameplay updates, I think that we can also say that this is a Destiny 3 change when it comes to the narrative and where it's heading. Why is that? Because we've now seen a world for what it is. The Witch Queen was at its center a narrative about looking in the mirror, looking at our enemies, and understanding that true evil kind of exists everywhere. Whether it's the lack of trust that is brewed between the Vanguard leaders, or the actions past and present of the Guardians, whether it's the Lucent Hive and their plans to abduct the Traveler, or whether it's the Witness and its plans for domination of the universe, evil in some form or another exists everywhere. Conversely, when one considers the perspectives of each faction, each one could technically be called good. One has to acknowledge that the Witch Queen, according to her own word, decided that she needed to save the Traveler, and even warned us against having foiled her plan when she died. When you even look at the contentious opinions of Rulk, he believes that he is serving the deserving even unto his final breath, and that this is the ultimate moral justification through the sword logic. Every single person in this narrative believes in what they're doing and believes that they are right. And at this point, Bungie has been okay with showing us that the perspectives of each party matter, and now we have the truth of what they're trying to get at. If the Age of Light was all about trying to tell us who we are, and the Age of Shadow, this second age that we are now closing, is trying to show us all about the world around us and about the idea that we don't have black and white morality and that there are many shades of grey, then we can maybe start to determine what the Age of Darkness is going to be. It's here, in this Age of Darkness that starts with Lightfall, that the third and final age of Destiny's saga will begin, I believe. This is our next inflection point. But what will this be, and what is the inflection point going to be about? Well, if you'll allow me an analogy, I think that our understandings of Destiny can best be compared to the birth of a moth. The Age of Light was the moment at which we were in our cocoon. Safe from the outside world, we would be allowed to grow and understand our new lives as Guardians, to develop into protectors in a simple and not so large world, with four walls always around us, containing us and keeping us safe from anything more dangerous. The Age of Shadow saw us bursting forth, emerging as something stronger, but reeling from such a sudden and harsh transformation brought upon by the world outside, showing itself for what it was. It was a metamorphosis and a revelation as we realized that the world was not so simple as we once believed. As we worked to break out of this cocoon of ignorance and waited for our wings to unfurl, we would see that the light and dark were not exactly forces of moral good or evil. They were what they were, forces within the universe that were not tied to morality. They were related to the Traveler and the Witness, but they were not completely controlled by them. Upon learning this final lesson, as we have in Witch Queen, I believe that we are now ready for the third age, the Age of Darkness. And this age is heralded by what exactly? To put it simply, we do what any moth does when it's broken free of its cocoon. We take flight. I believe that as we move into this final age of Destiny's narrative, the idea of choice will be what defines the stories. It is my belief that you can also see the first hints of this already, as Lightfall teases new details about the story. In particular, take a look at our closest narrative counterparts within Lightfall, the Cloud Striders. These are great heroes, comparable to Guardians, with immense powers and immense size too. They're enormous. But the point is, they've been gifted with abilities just like any Guardians might have, although admittedly not paracausal ones. But they weren't gifted with them just because. They chose them, as well as the burden of responsibilities that comes with them and comes with the mantle of a protector. I expect that narrative beats in Lightfall, Final Shape, and whatever comes next will follow this trend. The Cloud Striders of Lightfall chose to defend humanity, and I believe that in this next age of Destiny, as we approach this next inflection point, that will be the core message. What is going to be the future of the Sol system? We will choose it for ourselves, as both Guardians playing this game and characters that we see evolve alongside us. Just as the Age of Light's message was about who we are, and just as the Age of Shadow's message was about how the world is more complex than just light or darkness, I believe that the message of the Age of Darkness will have plot points that focus on the core message that we should all be able to make our own destiny. I expect stories about self-determination in the face of terrible circumstance. I expect our Guardians to finally become the masters of their own stories and lives. I expect the many people that have come to call Sol either their home or the place of refuge that they live in for the moment to either settle or leave, but no matter what, they will choose to do so, and hopefully they will choose to do so in harmony. And I anticipate that we too may spread our wings and gain a new responsibility to the universe around us beyond the borders of Sol. Our choice is to embody the word that defines us from the moment that we are rezzed. Guardians. I believe that that is where Destiny's Age of Darkness will ultimately lead us. It is about the idea that evil does exist, and that we can see it around us, and that having experienced the shades of grey, we can determine what and where it is. But we must still make the choice to do what is good over what is evil. It's been confirmed that even as the Light and Dark saga comes to a close, Destiny's story is not over. The world still has tales to tell, much of which will not be clear until we find them. As we move into those new days and approach the inflection point that leads to self-determination, I feel that we'll ultimately see a time of great disruption. But as the clouds do settle and the Light and Dark saga comes to a close, I think we'll ultimately spread our wings and choose to fly. Choice will be what defines Destiny next. Just as it's before been the idea of good and evil, and just as after that it was the idea of what is and isn't evil. Now, it will be about us taking the reins and making the choice. But that's all from me for now. This has been a bit of a weird video, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully it was informative. Hopefully it was something which gave you an idea of where I think the story of Destiny is going to go next, and hopefully that was entertaining to you all. If it was, go ahead and leave a like. If you want more Destiny content, go ahead and hit subscribe, and the bell next to subscribe to turn on those email notifications. And of course, as per usual, know that your viewership as always is quite enough for me, and that in the meantime my name is Byf. Per audacia ad astra. I'll see you, Starside.